tonight. The reason you're all here is that you're going to hear from Gary Shteyngart in conversation with Suketu Mehta. I was so excited to bring the two of them together in conversation, not because they don't come into conversation as it is, they're friends, so they talk all the time, but I thought that this was a wonderful way to kind of bring Gary's book to you. Both of them are children of Queens, the children of immigrants, and we're so excited that they're here. I'm going to do the formal introduction. Suketu Mehta is a New York-based author of Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found, which won the Kiriyama Prize and was a finalist for the 2005 Pulitzer Prize, the Lettres Ulysses Prize, the BBC4 Samuel Johnson Prize, and the Guardian First Book Award. He has won the Whiting's Writers Award, the O. Henry Prize, and a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship for his fiction. Mehta's work has been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, Granta, Harper's Magazine, Time, and Newsweek, and he has been featured on NPR's Fresh Air and All Things Considered. I also want to call attention to a recent review he wrote of in Time Magazine of Amy Chua's The Triple Package, which I think you will all find very illuminating. He is also an associate professor of journalism at NYU and is currently working on a book about New York and about immigrant stories in New York, for which he was awarded a 2007 Guggenheim Fellowship. And in addition to all of those things, he's very kind to spend time with us at the Tenement Museum, and he has been involved in our Tenement Talks program. So I'm excited to welcome him back to talk to Gary Shteyngart, who, if you've already read his memoir, then you know that the bio is very long. I'm just going to start reading from the memoir to give you the sense of a bio. Just kidding. He was born in Leningrad in 1972 and came to the United States 7 years later. He is the author of the novel Super Sad True Love Story, which won the Bollinger Everyman Woodhouse Prize and was selected as one of the best books of the year by more than 40 news journals and magazines around the world. Absurdistan, which was chosen as one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times Book Review and Time Magazine. The Russian Debutante's Handbook, winner of the Stephen Crane Award for First Fiction and the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Travel and Leisure, Esquire, GQ, the New York Times Magazine, and many other publications, and has been translated into 26 languages. Gary Shteyngart lives in New York City and also upstate New York. So please join me in welcoming Gary and Suketu.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. It's so great to be back on the Lower East Side, where I spent about 10 years of my life, 3 of those years in an actual tenement on Delancey and Clinton. I'm sure it's a condo by now. But I lived on the 5th, it was a 5th floor walk-up, and the phrase little failure, or failurechka, was coined in that apartment when my mother went up to visit me. I had just finished the Oberlin Institute for Advanced Individuals, and had promised her that I would go to law school, which is why she paid that hefty fee for it. And then I came out and said, I think I'm going to be a writer instead. So she came up to visit me. It was a 5-floor walk-up. It was a 100-square-foot apartment with a sloping floor, so you could go to bed here and wake up at the other side of it. My roommate was a water bug about the size of me. It had, it was wearing a bathrobe when she came in. It was just, hey, name's Sal. So my mother took a look around, saw the water bug, saw me, and said, you, my friend, are a failurechka, a little failure. And 20 years later, that gave birth to the title of this memoir. Critics have agreed that the best thing about this book is clearly its cover, which you could see here. I'm about a year and a half old. It's 1974. It's Leningrad, and they had this thing they would do where they would take you to a photo studio and they would pose you with the latest in Soviet technology. So, in this case, a Studebaker. In other parts of it, I'm posing with a phone. And I'm always crying. Well, the book is really about how I became a writer, and people often ask me, how do you become a writer? And I teach at an MFA program, and Suketu teaches at a journalism program, so we are doing this to other people now. But there's a couple of things you have to do. First thing you have to do is you have to be asthmatic. There's no way around that. You got to have asthma. I would grow up to be a writer. I would grow up in a damp, cold place like Leningrad, which is actually built on a swamp, so that's perfect. And in 1974, there were no steroid inhalers like we have here today, so you really got to see mortality up close as a child because you were always about to die. And I remember the wail of the ambulances in our courtyard always coming to take me to the hospital. Very good stuff for a writer. On this tour, this is day 83 of this long tour, people often bring me their asthma inhalers to sign, so I find that very sweet. Seattle has many people dying of asthma. The second thing is you got to have a grandma who writes. That's very important. And my grandmother, Galia, was a journalist for a paper called Evening Leningrad, Вечерний Leningrad, which is much better than Morning Leningrad, which is sort of the TMZ of communist papers. And one day when I was about 5, my grandma said to me, hey, asthma boy, you want to become a writer, And she said, I'll give you a piece of cheese for every page you write. And my God, I love that cheese, that almost kind of plastic, yellowy Soviet cheese. And right outside where we lived in Leningrad, there was the biggest statue of Lenin in all of Leningrad. I'm talking huge. And we called him the Latin Lenin because he always looked like he was about to rumba. He was very suave. And each morning when I wasn't sick from asthma, I'd come and hug Lenin around his pedestal. I really loved him. So my first novel was called Lenin and His Magical Goose. And in it, Lenin meets a goose, probably from Armenia or Georgia, someplace warm. And together they invade Finland and try to create a socialist revolution there. Then Lenin and the goose get into a huge political fight. I was obsessed with the Civil War of 1917, as most 5-year-old Russian children are. So we find out in the novel that the goose is Menshevik and Lenin is, of course, Bolshevik. So then Lenin eats the goose, but not before we discover that Lenin also suffers from asthma. And my grandmother, who was a very good communist, said, maybe he doesn't eat the goose, maybe he exiles the goose to Mexico, and then, ice pick, things will sort of take care of themselves. But my grandma loved it, and she paid me 100 pieces of cheese for a 100-page novel. A fun fact, even today, Random House pays me in cheese. So then we emigrated to America, and I had to leave Lenin behind, and I had to learn English and some Hebrew because I was sentenced to 8 years of Hebrew school for a crime I did not commit. But 1980 was a difficult time to be a Russian in America. You remember Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech and all those movies, starting with Red Dawn, Red Gerbil, Red Hamster, all that stuff. So I pretended to the kids in Hebrew school that I was actually born in East Berlin, not in Russia. Things are bad when you have to convince Jewish kids that you're actually a German. Because I was the Red Gerbil, the second most hated kid in Hebrew school, I thought, what if I wrote a science fiction novel and showed it to the kids in school? Maybe they will learn to like me. And then when I was about 11 years old, a momentous thing happened in the guise of a substitute teacher called Miss S. And this is the section that I'll read for about 7 minutes, and then we'll move on. On one of her first days on the job, Miss S asked us all to bring in our favorite items in the world and explain why they make us who we are. I bring in my latest toy, a dysfunctional Apollo rocket whose capsule pops off with the press of a lever, but only under certain atmospheric conditions. Humidity must be below 54%, and explain that I have even written my own novel. This passes largely unremarked as the latest batch of Star Wars X-Wing fighters and My Little Ponies are paraded around. Finally, Miss S holds up a sneaker and explains that her favorite activity is jogging. P.U., a boy cries out, pointing at the sneaker and holding his nose, and everyone except me laughs their wicked child laugh. I am shocked. Here is a young, kind, pretty teacher, and the children are intimating that her feet smell. Only me and my 200-pound Leningrad fur coat are allowed to smell around here. I look to Miss S, so worried that she will cry, but instead she laughs and goes on about how running makes her feel good. After we have all finished explaining who we are, Miss S calls me over to her desk. You really wrote a novel, she asks. Yes, I say. It is called The Challenge. May I read it? Yes, you may read it. I will brink it. And brink it I do, with the worried admonition, please don't lose, Miss S, okay? And then it happens. At the end of the English period, when a book about a mouse who has learned how to fly in an airplane has been thoroughly dissected, Miss S announces, and now Gary will read from his novel. His what? Oh, but it doesn't matter because I'm standing there holding my composition notebook straight from the Square Deal Notebook people of Dayton, Ohio, zip code 45463. And looking out at me are the boys beneath their little flying saucer yarmulkes and the girls with their sweet aromatic bangs, their blouses studded with stars. And there's Miss S, who I'm already terribly in love with, but who I've recently learned has a fiancé, not sure what that means, can't be good. But whose bright American face is not just encouraging me, but priding me on. Am I scared? No, I am eager to begin my life. Introduction, I say. The mysterious race. Before the age of dinosaurs, there was human life on Earth. They looked just like the man of today, but they were a lot more intelligent than the man of today. Slowly, Miss S says. Read slowly, Gary. Let us enjoy the words. I breathe that in. Miss S wants to enjoy my words. And then slower. They built all kinds of spaceships and other wonders, but at that time the Earth circled the moon because the moon was bigger than the Earth. One day a gigantic comet came and blew up the moon to the size it is today. As I'm reading it, despite the errors, I'm hearing a different language come out of my mouth. I do full justice to the many misspellings, the Earth circled the moon, and the Russian accent is still thick, but I am speaking in what is more or less comprehensible English. And as I am speaking, along with my strange new English voice, I'm also hearing something entirely foreign to the squealing and shouting that constitutes the background noise of my Hebrew school. Silence. The children are silent. They are listening to my every word, and they will listen to the story for the next 5 weeks as well, because Miss S will designate the end of every English period as Gary novel time. And they will shout out throughout the English period, when will Gary read already? The school is close to Long Island. And I will sit there in my chair, oblivious to all but Miss S.'s smile, excused from the following the discussion of the mouse who learned how to fly, so that I may go over the words I will soon read to my adoring audience. And God bless these kids for giving me a chance. May their God bless them, everyone. Thank you.
So Gary's been introduced already, so I won't repeat it. But earlier today, I asked Gary for a list of topics we could discuss. You know, writerly things about the state of world literature today, if the novel is dead, if he knows where the Malaysian plane is.
Clinton Street for sure.
But, you know, immigration policy, we're in the Tenement Museum, so... And then Gary very graciously emailed me a list of topics that he would like to discuss. So I'll just lead off with that. What was it like to kiss James Franco?
So to promote this book, of course, had to create a video. People don't like to read books much, but they love the trailers that come with books. And these days, you have to have a trailer. So my trailer had Rashida Jones, a lovely woman. Jonathan Franzen played my psychiatrist. The guy from Girls played the barrister in Brooklyn. Alex Karpovsky, fellow Russian. And James Franco played my husband, which involved a very long kissing scene, of which we had 68 takes. He is, first of all, he was a student of mine, so this is, I had to kiss a student, which Columbia sort of is okay.
Columbia allows that.
It's a hands-on environment at our school. But what I noticed was the moistness of his lips and how dry mine were by comparison. And I think, he's just a superior species of human being, because they stayed moist for 68 takes. And I felt so embarrassed. I kept slathering myself with creams. And
then there was some controversy around the video. You got accused of being homophobic. Are you?
Kissing James Franco can make you homophobic. that was the... I never quite understood that argument, but I had to apologize profusely.
Take it from me, Gary's not homophobic, really.
Not at all.
Number 2 on Gary's list of questions to himself. Why did you decide to write a memoir now? Many people in Brooklyn hate memoirs. Why don't you?
People really hate memoirs. I mean, I got a lot of stuff for doing this, because real literature is supposed to be, novels and short stories and video trailers about them, but not memoirs. But I've always been a real sucker for memoirs, starting with Nabokov's Speak Memory. Oh, that's a good book. Mine is sort of a lesser version of that. I love Mary Carr's The Liars Club, and she was very encouraging. Suketu and I belong to a kind of little group of male immigrant writers. So we have 2 Indians, 1 Russian, an Austrian, and a Texan.
New York.
But the Texan is probably the most foreign of all of us in New York.
He was in the Marines.
He was in the Marines. There you go. So talking to Mary, who grew up in Texas, about writing a memoir was very instrumental. What's his name? Frank McCourt, who taught at, I went to the Stuyvesant, the multicultural holding pen for nerds, and he was a teacher there, but I had missed him by a year, sadly. But now I live in the building where he spent most of his life. So anyway, I am 41, which in Russian years is 74, so it's time to get cracking here and get this thing out there.
Critics have compared you to Nabokov. In fact, you have compared yourself to Nabokov. But I definitely see the influence of Panin in a lot of your books. And I mean, you clearly read Nabokov. Who else did you read while you were writing Little Failure?
Well, I think going back to Nabokov is like getting a booster shot. It inculcates you against crap because it's just every sentence is so wonderfully rendered. Who else did I read your book quite a bit, because even though it's set in India, Maximum City, it really America hovers above it in a certain way.
Maximum Failure.
Maximum Failure was a great title. I wish my mother had called me that. Then 12 years of psychiatry could have been avoided. What else did I read? Trying to think of other. I mean, there's so many. The memoir is a very rich genre now. The Glass Castle is a wonderful book. Jeanette Winterson wrote a book whose title I always forget, but which is very nice. Sorry, that's not very helpful. It's something or other by Jeanette Winterson.
No,
I think
normal is. When you're writing a memoir, it's not like as you're growing up, you're taking notes for your future memoir. Maybe you were. You always take notes.
I always took notes. I always wanted revenge, and so. You got to start early for that, Even as kids were calling me the red gerbil in Hebrew school, I was like, could you spell that for me? G with a capital. Yeah.
Has anyone in the book come up to you and said, I'm not like that. You remembered it wrong?
No, and partly it's because I did a lot of interviews as I was writing the book. So I would sit down with people I grew up with, and people from, my parents, obviously, relatives, and people from Hebrew school. From Stuyvesant, Oberlin. What's funny is those were the years it's very hard to remember Oberlin. I don't know what the hell happened. My nickname was Scary Gary because I managed to smoke more pot than anyone else on campus, which is very prodigious amount.
At Oberlin, that's really saying something.
That was really. I got an award from the faculty for that. And there were all these things that it was very interesting to talk to people because so much I'd forgotten because of all that stuff. So the way I wrote the book is I'd wake up every morning and I'd say, okay, I'm 11 years old now. What's my life like? What's going to happen to me next? So it was a kind of trip down memory lane. But it's frightening to do that because you spend most of your adult years trying to repress what happened.
Right.
And all of a sudden it just starts to bubble up.
Yeah, because the book's not just funny. There's a lot of darkness in it and pain and real pain. And it begins with this evocation of pain, and then there's a sort of coming to understanding with it. So your book is dedicated to your parents and to your shrink. Discuss.
I've had a wonderful shrink. I haven't heard him talk ever because it's old school Freudian, so who knows what he thinks of me. But he's a calming, sort of white-bearded presence behind me. He's been very helpful, and my parents have been very helpful. Without them, there would be no book because there would be no material. When you grow up with parents who call you little failure and snotty and things like that, you got something to write about. But in writing this book, it was interesting because I think, like many immigrant kids from very tough Amy Chua type parents, where you will succeed or will kill you, I grew up in my 20s and 30s feeling this kind of anger toward them. Why can't they just embrace the fact that I'm not going to be a successful capitalist American? I'm just going to be this, sort of failing nonprofit type of dude. Why can't you just love me for that? But as I started writing this book especially, I started to realize that all those feelings of anger really became submerged into kind of feelings of sorrow for them, that they grew up in a very terrible society, that they never had the chance to realize their dreams. My father, for example, wanted to be an opera singer. Not too many Jewish opera singers running around the Soviet Union at that point. And as I started to interview them, the book began to take on a kind of, what I hoped at least would be a more historic depth. My father's first memories, for example, were being told that his father was killed right outside of Leningrad as the Germans advanced, then jumping underneath a train that was being strafed by the Luftwaffe, then being moved to a holding area for people who had escaped from Leningrad, and his best friend, 3 years old, starved to death or died of malnutrition. His cousin jumped out of a window because she was being pursued by rats who were trying to eat children, and then hiding under the kitchen table and crying because of his father's death and trying to sing opera and trying to go back in time and kill Hitler. That was his big dream. Those are the first 5 memories of his life, My mother has entire photo albums which, are titled Uncle So-and-so and his family buried alive in Belarusia in 1943, so we're not talking Cape Cod vacation. Getting that grounding, getting that historical grounding really did shift the way I saw my parents, so that by the time I started writing this book, by the time I finished writing it, they were completely different parents from the ones I'd started with. And I always wondered, why didn't they talk more about these things? I was always curious as to what their lives were like, but only when I started to formally interview them and ask them about, their very, very early years, did I realize that they grew up, with Hitler and Stalin sort of being a part of the family in a horrible way.
Yeah, the most fascinating figure in your autobiography is not you, it's your father. And I remember when you were writing it, we were talking about it, and I said, how are your parents going to react to this? Are they ever going to speak to you again? And then you had a kid, and then they have to speak to you because to get to the...
They got to speak to me to speak to the kid.
Clever,
yeah. Very clever, yeah. Well, and I think partly the reason I started writing this thing is that I never thought I would have a kid. And it was happening, I thought, at least I want to figure out, what the good and bad parts of my own parenting was, so that so I can save the good stuff and avoid some of the, some of the other stuff. And there was good stuff. There was a lot of good stuff. I think my grandmother I talked about and the way she encouraged me with cheese to write, but my father would take me around when we lived in Kew Gardens, Queens, and he would take me around and he would tell me these stories that he would make up himself called The Planet of the Yids. And the planet of the Yids was a planet in some kosher nebula galaxy that was constantly under attack by Slavs who were bombing it with pork torpedoes. And the planet was run by Captain Nathan Sharansky, a famous dissident, of course, and Captain Sharansky was constantly building space shields with which to deflect this lard. It was bizarre and satiric, but I would just keep saying, let's go and tell me more Planet of the Yids, and that's, I don't think I could write a book with a title like Absurdistan without my father, telling me these kinds of stories. So that's the part that I would love to continue on with my child, that endless narrative and humor and all that good stuff.
Well, when I was last here at the Tenement Museum, I was introducing this wonderful book edited by Nancy Fauner. It's called 1 Out of 3, and it's a non-fiction account of immigrants in New York. And the theme that ran through all of these immigrant accounts from wherever they were in the world, Jamaica, Russia, India, China, is this puzzlement on the part of the immigrant parents that if they beat their children in America, the authorities would take notice, something they took for a God-given right. And you've got some affecting scenes in your book about your father beating you. And I remember when you were writing this, how they're going to take this. But there's also really moving resolution of this, of the pain you felt getting beaten up. Have your parents read the book yet?
They haven't, because they don't really read English that well. So usually they have to wait for the book to be translated into Russian. And my 3 previous novels have all been translated into Russian, but this one thankfully has not been. So maybe they never will.
We'll keep it from
But I think, when I was very happy when the reviews were coming out, that so many reviews did call it, I think one of them called it a difficult love letter to my parents, and I think that's what it is. And I think if it's not difficult, if it's just, oh my God, the immigrant came, he saw, he conquered, everything went great, then that's just lies, because one out of a million maybe that way happens. But I teach Henry Roth's Call It Sleep, for example, and the introduction by Alfred Kazin, the dean of Jewish literature at the time, talks about how people always thought that the Jews of that time, 1905, that the enmity was from without, that it was pogroms and whatever. But he talks about how so often the enmity was also from within, that a lot of these families came with a great sense of dysfunction, as shown in Henry Roth's Call It Sleep, which is set, I think, somewhere around here. But what's been interesting on this book tour, which has been, as I've said, heroic, is that wherever I go, Americans say, native-born Americans will say, "Oh my God, it's horrible. How could people treat their children like this?" And then the Russians will get up during the signing and say, "Could you, through tears, could you sign this book to little failure / failed paralegal?" And they'll say things like, I did everything they said. I became a corporate lawyer, but my nickname is still Shithead. What gives? But it's and I think when I got to Stuyvesant, that's sort of when I saw the great equalization of that, because all my friends were Indian, Korean, Chinese, and almost all of them, the boys, had some kind of physical aspect to their child rearing, and all of us had this kind of emotional, you will succeed. We did not come all the way here for you to fail. So the word fail and failure was a huge part of my vocabulary, and perhaps of yours as well when you were growing up.
Oh, most certainly. We have the same equivalent in Gujarati, Hindi, all the Indian languages.
That's so sweet to know.
Yeah. You got a B+, you have shamed us. You have shamed all of India.
A fellow Indian writer that we know, his mother once spit on the floor and said, "You are not worth the spit on this floor." Yes. Which I thought was so poetic,
Yeah, and did you have issues when you went outside the Jewish faith in your choice of a wife? Was there?
Not really, because I'd never really gotten together with. I think I dated one Jewish girl once, so they knew what to expect. They were just happy that she knows how to play the piano and went to Harvard. That's all that matters at this point.
Going to Harvard is very important.
She might as well be Jewish, yeah.
Well, you write about going to Stuyvesant. When you first go to Stuyvesant, you have a revelation, and you write, "Looking down at others is one of the few things that has kept me afloat through the years. The comfort in thinking that entire races are lower than my family, lower than me." I first thought this was a quotation from Amy Chua, but it's actually you. But you get to Stuyvesant and you say, "Stuyvesant in 1987 resembles a Lower East Side tenement at the turn of the century." So you suddenly realize that there, were other people just like you, but in this really crappy school. It's in much nicer digs now.
Yeah, now it looks like a Morgan Stanley, but back then it really looked. There was a school on 15th Street. It was cramped. I mean, it was bursting to the gills with immigrants. It was just this tiny and completely falling apart. And then, of course, they moved to that nice school. But I still like the fact that we went to that, very tenement-y kind of place, and because it was in the East Village. It wasn't in Battery Park City or whatever. It felt like the real New York. We all had muggers' wallets where you would put your real money in a sock, and then you would have a fake wallet with like $5. So, but New York City always loved its nerds so much that it was called the L train. It had a safe train where armed SWAT teams would accompany us to the train, little nerds, and to make sure that the local gang called the Decepticons wouldn't attack us and steal our $5 wallets. But the fact was that we grew up. I mean, there was, I talk about this quite a bit. It was a very racist. It was far right wing. We remember, everyone loved Ronald Reagan. The words "welfare queen" were spoken all the time. Oh, those welfare queens, whom we never met or saw, but they were out there somewhere. We were scared to death of anyone who was a different color. My grandmother would grab me when I was 13 years old. Would grab me as I exited the Hebrew school bus, and sort of put her arms around me as we walked 2 blocks through Forest Hills, Queens, to make sure that nobody would attack her precious grandson. We had this completely awful, and it was all fed by television, but also I think for a feeling that here we were, immigrants, we didn't speak the language, there had to be somebody who the media treated as being worse than us. And in Ronald Reagan's America, that was very easy to find.
And what is it like going from Stuyvesant to Oberlin?
It was insane. I mean, Stuyvesant was very difficult because there's math and science there. One is terrible enough, but there were both, and I don't know nothing about math or science. And then I got to Oberlin, and the first assignment was to watch Blade Runner and talk about my feelings about Blade Runner. It was insane. I majored in Gary studies, which was just basically writing about my mom for 4 years with a
And
minor.
you're still doing that?
I'm still doing that. It's a PhD at this point. And I had a minor in the Beatles because my roommate at Oberlin, students are allowed to teach classes. Not a good idea by any stretch of the imagination. So he was a Beatles professor. So we would just take acid and listen to Revolver and like lean against the wall for like 4 hours and got 5 credits for that. So, I mean, the funny thing about Oberlin is like I would send my kid there now because he'll grow up, going to Friends or whatever. But a kielbasa-fueled refugee like me, no way in hell. I should have been at state school or something.
And then when you came back to New York, you worked at, was it Nyana?
I worked for Nyana, but I also worked for the Education Alliance, which is a wonderful local organization on East Broadway. I spent 2 or 3 years as a grant writer there. That was actually, and yes, certain people are from there as well. That was actually one of the nicest things I've ever done in my life. I actually tried to help other people, which...
How'd that work out?
Not well. As an only child narcissist, it was hard to picture other people, but there they were, I'd write grants for them, I wrote grants for, some of it was really great, but then there was stuff like Torah tots that I was like, what on earth, After trying to escape Hebrew school for so long, here I was trying to connect tots with Torah, so... but it was a marvelous, and still is a marvelous organization.
Yeah. And you liked it so much that you actually moved here at a certain point. And I remember visiting you in this building all the way by the river and seeing the ad for the klezmer lessons in the lobby. Did you ever take klezmer lessons?
I thankfully did not. I'm not a klezmerite. I'm more of a hip hop kind of guy, but I understand the two are intimately related. It was interesting because it was like living in a shtetl in a way, like this giant vertical shtetl. And it's a super sad true love story. My novel is set almost entirely in those co-ops. It was amazing. There was a shiva board where you could see who had passed on, and you could walk around sitting shiva in the different places. And if you were hungry, this was a good way to eat your way through, Sabbath. There were a lot of Hasidic people who had all these very strange rules, like on some days they couldn't use a key to open the master lock, but if the key was attached to their belt or something, then that was kosher. So you'd see some older gentleman like trying to get a door open. And it was really like the whole variety of human experience. You had the 3 H's, which is very important: Hasidic, Hispanic, and hipster. And we had all those. I really miss those buildings. We had to move for geographical reasons, but that was the best place I've ever lived, I think, is the East River Housing Co-op.
But now you've spent a considerable time, part of your time in the country, this bucolic place in I won't give away the address, but
visit me,
upstate, the Hudson address.
Bring Bialys.
Yeah. And there, you really, I never knew you liked nature so much. I didn't imagine you as someone from the Sound of Music, yodeling across the mountains. But that's what you do now.
That's basically what I do now, yeah.
You look at sheep, you send out pictures to your friends.
I send a lot of sheep pictures that have worried some mental health professionals. Well, Hebrew school, the Red Gerbil, I really felt like this outsider. But each summer we would go to the Catskills near Ellenville, New York, to a place which was just a Russian bungalow colony, surrounded by Hasids who were always trying to convert us to their hirsute ways. But we were this small, and this was a fascinating thing for me because everyone was a Russian-speaking immigrant my age. The girls were beautiful. My first crushes were, and I'd spend the whole year dying to go up there because we spoke this kind of patois of Russian and English, mostly English. We'd sit on each other's laps, we'd watch E.T., the extraterrestrial, and try to figure out what the hell was going on. It really felt like a very, very safe place. And in my mind, that safe place has always been associated with, sheep running around and that kind of stuff. So all my life, I wanted to spend half the year around there. And now I live on the other side of the bank. Of the Hudson. My local neighbor says, "Oh, those, the Jewish Alps." That's what he calls the Catskills. Yes. So that was always a dream of mine. And also, of course, I am a huge fan of Henry Roth. And after he wrote Call It Sleep, he had a huge nervous and mental breakdown. And he moved to Maine and lived in the wilderness for a while, where he was a duck and goose farmer for a while. And I always wanted to have a breakdown like his and go through all that as well. And then slowly find my way back to New York.
So your writing routine there, as I understand, is you wake up after 11 hours of sleep, and you have a husband, not James Franco, but the chair with the padded arms, and then you just write for
4 hours.
4 hours. And then you take a nap.
Then I take a nap. Then the hour, we do the shrink by phone now. A lot of writers up there, so at 6 o'clock we gather for a 5-hour dinner, and then at 11 is the crying hour, when we cry about the state of publishing. It's very sad. It's simulcast on WQED, so if you're late at night, you want to hear some writers crying after you get your Beethoven fill, you can hear it. I have a beautiful wail, I'm told.
So, your book was Michiko Kakutani, who never likes male writers, wrote, and I'm going to embarrass you, says, of the many enormously gifted authors now writing about the immigrant experience, including Jhumpa Lahiri, Edwidge Danticat, Dino Mengistu, Chang Reilly, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and Gish Jen, Gary Shteyngart is undoubtedly the funniest. She compares you to Chekhov. Now, as a man who has written 123 blurbs comparing other people to Chekhov, how does it feel to be compared to yourself?
That shocked me. I couldn't write a blurb that beautiful if I say to save my life. Yeah, Ms. Kakutani has been nice to me for 2 books in a row. I don't know what gives, but it's very exciting. Nobody has that kind of influence as she does. I am a prodigious blurb writer. I've blurbed closer to 200 now, 200 books in the last 10 years. I have very strict guidelines for what I will blurb. There have to be 2 covers, a spine, and an ISBN number.
There's a whole Tumblr of Gary's blurbs. You can look it up.
Yes, it's called In Praise of Promiscuous Prose. No, it's been good. Chang Reilly was my mentor, another great, wonderful immigrant, and at Hunter College. Yay, Hunter. And he got me a book deal 2 weeks into going to Hunter. And I said, what can I do to ever repay you? And he said, just pay it forward. I don't think he used that cliche, but whatever. So I decided that the way I would do it is by blurbing everyone in sight, and that's what I've been doing. And who knows if it has an effect. By this point, with that many blurbs, the market value of my blurbs is probably so low that it probably detracts people from buying the book. They're like, oh shit, even Shteyngart blurbed this one.
Well, if a book that I'm buying doesn't have your blurb, then I think there's something really wrong with it. So that's how it works. But as an immigrant, one is an outsider in American society. As a writer in an immigrant family, one is doubly an outsider. So as you were growing up, much of this book is this account of your parents' deep suspicion of your craft and your vocation. And now, Little Failure is on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a huge success. So has your parents' view of you changed? Czeslaw Milosz wrote, and you quote him in the book, that something like, unlucky is the family that has a writer born into it.
Once a writer is born, the family dies, is the more Polish way to put it, as he did, yes. Well, it's interesting. My parents have been incredibly proud of me, especially since I've been able to monetize this stuff. But, at my wedding, Deborah Treisman, the editor of The New Yorker, came up to my father and said, so what do you think of Gary's work? And he said, the first one was okay. Which really touched me. I thought, oh, okay. Because when it came out, he called me a mudak, which is a testicle man in Russian. So I thought, from testicle man to okay is a great journey.
Maybe the first compliment was actually, in his mind, the more important one.
More important one.
Man with testicles.
Man with testicles. You know, ballsy writer, yeah. You know, our opinions, our political views are very different, my parents and I, and they take that very seriously. You know, whenever I see them, my father will dredge up something from the, it doesn't matter what Michiko said, she'll say, you think you're great, but, you know, Misha from Murmansk says you're a schmuck. So, you know, the internet has been very helpful to giving them a fuller picture of how I'm viewed out there. But there is a lot of pride and a lot of happiness that I'm able to do something that I love, you know.
So in an interview in the Financial Times with my colleague Katie Royfey, you said, quote, "My two arsenals are laughter and horniness. Those two are in all my books. It might seem conservative, too Rothian or Belovian, but it works. Dude wants to sleep with this hot chick. She can't speak no English. Laughter ensues." So is writing well the Nebeshev's best revenge?
I can't believe I said that. First of all, this was way before I was married. And I was very drunk. The whole thing is like 12 drinks with Katie Royfey is the name of the article. No, horniness is wrong. It's terrible. Just laughter.
Laughter.
No, I think you know, romance is that's how I would put it. Is important. I mean, I'm an old-fashioned kind of writer, and that stuff still happens in my books. It's about families, and it's always about relationships. So there's no sort of abstract journey in my books. It's all very concrete. And in that way, I guess so many of my books have been about people in their 20s and 30s, even though I've exited that group, because I think that's a time of so much great ferment and interest in one's life. That's when I was at my greatest in terms of writing down things in my journal.
And now there's another generation of Shteyngart writers. So are you telling little Johnny stories from the planet of the Yids?
My kid's 5 months old, but my wife already reads to him in German and French. I'm sure he'll learn Mandarin very quickly, as one has to these days. But I've wondered if I should teach him Russian or not.
Hindi, try Hindi.
Hindi would be great. Hindi would be terrific. Crimean would be another language we could try to annex into his vocabulary. I don't know. I mean, I think, I would love for him to be polyglot. But I do think, and I find China incredibly fascinating, India as well. I think Mandarin and Hindi would be wonderful languages. Although when I go to India, everyone speaks perfect English.
Exactly. No one speaks Hindi.
No one speaks Hindi. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take some questions from the audience.
Or concerns, complaints.
Refunds, Kevin.
The book, as I told you before, I loved, and I read it in almost, I think, just 2 sittings. I finished within 24 hours. And I've studied New York history all my life, not all my life, in my professional life, and I feel like I learned something about New York from reading the book and the stories that you tell in the different perspectives. My question is about what is your connection to immigrants today, in the sense of, when you teach, are you more drawn to the students who have immigrant stories? Do you feel the need to, you said you went back to Salomon Schechter, but to rescue those students there? How do you connect back
Exodus.
that way?
Well, you know, I never, Philip Roth was always asked, you know, are you a Jewish writer? And he always kind of chafed against it. He said, no, I'm an American writer. People hate to be put into a kind of category, and so many reviews. There was a great review of Dina Mengestu's book in the Times on the cover, and it sort of started out with, you know, let's not talk about immigrant writers. I don't care about these kind of, you know, call me a Jewish writer, a Russian writer, an immigrant writer, whatever. Just call me, you know, just call me. I don't have any problems with that. And there has been, you know, I am interested in the immigrant experience. It's not something that I want to run away from. The reason I think I have so many immigrant students at a place like Columbia is I think other writers want to capture that experience in their writing. Columbia is incredibly diverse. I think I also teach classes like Immigrants a Go-Go, where, you know, which is about contemporary immigrant writing. So, and a lot of my friends happen to be immigrant writers. And we all sort of came together at the same time. We all had our first books published around the same time. So, you know, it's interesting. Like, there's still an amazing need for immigrant literature in America that doesn't exist in other countries. You know, when I go to Germany or France, et cetera, there are writers from immigrant backgrounds, but they don't have the same kind of audiences almost that we have in America. So, and that I think goes back to the idea that this is an incredibly immigrant nation, and we are obviously in one of the great immigrant cities of the world.
Great. So I think there's someone with a microphone. So if you raise your hand, just wait till you get the microphone before you ask the question.
As a New Yorker and as someone involved with the MFA system, do you have an opinion on the MFA versus New York City question raised recently by a bunch of writers who had an essay collection? And
I haven't been following that, but I could never get to the bottom of that question. I mean, to be a writer these days, you have to have an MFA. I mean, almost every writer except you have one too. Yeah, every writer has one. So no, nobody's proud of it, but every single writer has one. Back in the day, you had to have a real experience, like you had to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and then you became a writer. Nowadays, it's 3 years in Iowa. So
That's exactly what I did.
that's exactly what you did, and I can see your battle scars. Did Franco torture you personally?
Or the pigs I could write about.
Oh, jeez. Oh, the livestock. Yes. It has to be done. I'm sorry. It has to be done. Whenever the 20 under 40 New Yorker thing comes out, you count how many of those writers have MFAs. I think the last one, 17 out of 20 had them. So, hell with that. You just need one. Oh, should I pick people?
Who was the most hated kid in the class if you were only number 2?
Right.
What, 3-part question.
Ah.
What was his name and why was he the most hated?
Thank you. This is all explained in my book. He was native-born Jewish kid from not a wealthy family. Wealth mattered in this school quite a bit. I can't use legally his name, so legal changed it to Jonah Himelstein, which I think is a great name, but his name had elements of that. He was a real mess. His shoes were always untied. Mine were always untied, but I had one untied shoe. He had both, and he would trip over and fall. His shirt, what are these called? Shirt tails? What's that? My English not so good. ESL all the way, baby. His shirt tail would stick out of his fly, like a little genital of sorts. And people would just hit him more than me. I was pretty beatable, I was very punchable, but this kid was even more so. And one of the scenes in this book is that after a long day of violence, I finally come over and just punch him in the stomach. And that's sort of, I know, not exactly proud of it, but that's the way male aggression works. It goes downhill. You find whoever's even worse off than you are. And if I were a better person, I would have restrained myself. But Jonah Himelstein met my fist as well. But I hit him in the stomach, which is a nice plushy part. My mother always screamed at my father, just don't hit him on the head. Because the head is for thinking and monetizing.
He handed me the mic by mistake, so I'm just going to ask a question. I've read reviews where you've actually been faulted for being too funny, which is a problem most writers would kill to have. But you've actually said that it's a problem for you as well. And I think you said in this book that you were going to try and avoid a pitfall of that. Do you feel like you did that?
Yeah. The Wall Street Journal, in a beautiful passive-aggressive review, said something like, "Can a writer be too brilliant? Yes." Or something like that. Yeah. No, I tried consciously, because this isn't satire. The last 3 books I wrote, the last 3, like I've had a career of 30 books. The only 3 other books I've written have been satires. And when you're in satire, you're in a kind of mode. Look, I want to entertain my writers, so it's funny, maybe not so funny, funny, not so funny. You can't use that formula when you're trying to write an honest-to-God memoir, where most things are true, have happened to you, have happened to others. You owe it to others to just not make a complete joke out of it. That said, you have to entertain. I hate books that don't entertain. I mean, the great writers that we look up to in the 20th, 19th, 18th century were not abstract writers. They were writers who were trying to capture what the world around them was like. That's not to say that writing has to be static. I mean, it does change. I hope that this is a very different memoir from the memoirs that have come before it. But when you write a memoir, you do have the duty to be honest, and that honesty sometimes requires that, it's not just one joke after the next, although hopefully there are enough jokes here to sustain a reader's interest for 350 pages. And there's also a lot of photographs here. Each chapter has an embarrassing photograph with an embarrassing caption, so that's important.
What are you currently reading, and who is your favorite author?
What am I currently... okay.
What are you currently reading, And who is your favorite author?
Thank you. Well, right now I'm writing a book about a woman in the financial industry who's had enough and is just shooting people around the world. So this requires a lot of books about finance and shooting people around the world. So it's a whole cast of different books that there was a book about the Galleon scandal. It's a book about Indian Americans. Like, what's the name of that book? I think it's called The Galleon something. It's this gigantic.
I know the one you mean.
Yeah. So it's full of arcane information about finance and Indians, a wonderful cross-section, which I've been having a lot of fun with. A book called Young Money, which is about first year financial analysts straight out of Princeton and stuff like that. I find myself reading a lot of nonfiction because the books I write, well, this memoir was different, but the books I write are so heavily into, like, for example, for Super Sad True Love Story, I had to learn all about technology. So for 2 years, I found myself reading only about technology and hiring a young person, this beautiful male intern, the man-turn, my friends call him, who's taught me how the iTelephone works and things like that. So a lot of what I read is research. My favorite writers, there's so many. I would still say Nabokov. I mean, it's a lot of the Russians, because that's who I grew up with. Chekhov for empathy. Whenever you want to build up your empathy muscle, Chekhov can write. He'll write 11 pages about some school teacher in a provincial town who's in God knows where in Russia, who's, a horse and carriage got stuck in the mud, and in a tiny scene you could see what her entire life has been before this and what her life will be like for the rest of her life. That's a kind of insane skill that is so hard for someone like me to master. The closest in terms of storytelling in America, I think George Saunders comes to mind. It's something that's very hard to do. But I think Chekhov and Nabokov, they're two very different writers. Chekhov more for empathy, Nabokov more for just a sense of style. No? Yeah? No? I thought you had it before.
At what age did you feel proficient in English, and how did you get rid of your accent?
I was about 14 when it all stopped. The craziness ended. The reason I had I came at 7, and a lot of kids who come that age lose their accent like that. But I think the reason I didn't was we only spoke Russian in the house. My parents made the decision that their English wouldn't be as hot because the kid always brings English into the house. But when I walked in, it was all Russian all the time. There was no television, which is another reason I couldn't learn English pronunciation well. So outside it was all the A-Team and whatever, and inside it was Lady with Lapdog all the time. So there was a very clear demarcation between English and Russian in the household. When I got the television, my grandmother had a TV, so I started watching it whenever I could. But it was a 1950s model that got either visuals or sound, never at once. So I would watch one thing, I would watch an episode and write down what was being said if I heard it, and then try to match it, whenever it was rerun, try to match it to the visuals, which was actually helpful for a writer as well. But I was so confused by TV because I kept thinking, I would watch Gilligan's Island and I would think, a country this rich with a navy so powerful can't find someone as important as the millionaire and his wife. I mean, it made no sense, but...
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Suketu.
Thank you, Suketu.